Building a jigsaw puzzle can be compared to the learning process. When you come to a difficult piece, put it to the side, wait for later, and carry on building up your pattern as you go. Another difficult piece, put it to the side. As the pattern develops and other difficult pieces are discarded, the general form begins to take shape. And those difficult pieces fit in easily. After the structure of information has completed itself, you're prepared at your review stage now to take notes, and I'll use an example here of the study we've been involved with, the location of the mind. We might start by having a dotted line to indicate that long time period when nothing really happened at all. So we put hundreds of thousands of years where basically we didn't know anything about it. Our next section might be the Greeks. Now we can give them a bit of color and dimension. And from there, we would add the important sections in the Greek area. Now we might, for example, have the various famous people, the Greek philosophers. So we'd have Plato. And Plato was in fact famous for his wax tablet hypothesis, which said that the mind was like a wax tablet. Experience was written on it, and time gradually eroded it. So here you just might have a little symbol of Plato's wax tablet. We would then have the other philosophers, which would include Parmenides, Aristotle, and a host of others. Now again, we can give these a bit more coding. For Aristotle, we know that he centered in the heart many of the areas which we now know to be in the brain, so we give him a little heart. And for Parmenides, with his fluids, and the others, for example, with spirits, we could have little impression of a spirit and some indication of fluids. And when we completed this section on the Greeks, we could map that whole area off. Now the Greeks would be followed by the Dark Ages, and here we can again symbolize a black center, the Dark Ages. Now, one of the only rays of light in the Dark Ages was a philosopher called Galen. He was a religious philosopher who basically accepted the ideas of Aristotle, so we can have an arrow. And Galen's ideas were in turn accepted by the church and stated as church dogma. So we have religion. And they were accepted so strongly that little progress was made. So again, we circle off this particular area. Now after that we come to the 16th, 17th, 18th century, the Renaissance. And here once again we have a series of particularly influential characters. Now, perhaps prime among those was Newton. And of course, there were all the others. Now, at this particular stage in history, it was discovered that the mind was concerned with electrical impulses and with chemical interactions. So again, we could have a small symbol for that. Electrical impulses and something for chemical interactions. And again, this area can be circled off, perhaps here in a different color. Now another point about this was that in this time period, it was finally confirmed that most of the thought processes were located in the brain. So we can have an arrow from this whole section back to our center. Now our final section would be the modern thought. And here, of a number of ways you could choose, you might decide to branch it off by country or area. So we could have the USSR, United States of America, Europe, and all the other areas. Now from this, we could branch off, again, noting those researchers who were particularly important. And from them, again, we can have arrows going into the center showing those particular areas of the brain that they're concerned with. And on those arrows, you could print the appropriate information. And once again, this area can be circled. Now at this stage, you've actually completed your application section of study. Your final notes are made, the information is all there as you wish to have it. And in fact, this looks like a brain pattern itself. But I want now to go back and look at the overall picture of the application section. We've completed it, but during the process, it's important that a number of things continue to be done. Now, the first one of these, of course, is the use of the visual guide. And this is done throughout the process. And I want to explain briefly here why it's so important to use a visual guide. If you wanted to look at this particular graph, your eye does not slide down it. It takes in the information in chunks, 3, and then goes off and looks at the information underneath. So the graph of your eye movement would be down, down, along, and back, which is not the same as the graph that you've been learning about. So your mind has two memories, the memory of the graph as it is, and the memory of your eye movement graph, and they contradict, so your memory will be poor. Now, if you use a visual guide, as follows, the memory of the shape will be right, the memory of your eye movement pattern will be correct, and you'll have two other memories as well, the memory of seeing this thing move over the page, and the memory of your muscles moving. So you have 4 positive memories instead of 1 good and 1 bad. So the visual guide is really essential. And as I mentioned, it's also essential not only in the overview on graphs, but also for regular reading. Now again, throughout this entire process, you should have been using all the information given to you from the previous programs, using the memory techniques, proper notation techniques, general learning, and so on. There's also another particularly important thing that should be going on throughout this, and this is selection and rejection. Now, as you're overviewing, previewing, and inviewing, you're trying to sort out that information that you actually want to keep. Now, there are a number of tips for sifting out information which is in some way suspect. A number of these, for example, if the author is using emotional language, using Christian names and positive words to describe something, that information is, in a sense, suspect, as it would be if he were using negatively emotional words. He's taking you along an emotional path rather than the information. So that information is suspect. Other kinds of suspect information. If an author says, "We all know that," everybody knows. Do we all know? If you nip down into the pub, you find that perhaps we don't, or that we do disagree. So these kind of tips, tremendously important for actually selecting and rejecting that information you want to note, that information that you want to disregard. Once you've completed all of that, your initial study application period is over, and you then enter into your long-term learning. And there are two main factors here. The first one, down here after you've done your pattern, is the review graph. Now you recall that after 10 minutes, your learning recall reaches a high point. After that, you lose 80% within a day, so you must maintain it. Now the maintenance of this information can only be done by coordinating your reviews regularly with your pattern notes. So we look at the patterns, and what you have to do here is to review by using the pattern, by checking the information. Now if you imagine this as your major ongoing pattern, you find that what you do is add to it after each study period. And as I mentioned before, as this pattern expands, it begins to touch on all those other areas surrounding your information, which means that you finally become able to criticize, to integrate, to understand where you need more study. What happens then is that as you read more books, you have more information, you can ask better questions, establish your goals, know more, learn more. And in the final analysis then, all your learning, all your studying, instead of being a boring, dull, oppressive process, actually becomes really, really enjoyable.